The morning Caleb Morrison walked into Hartwell Industries for a job interview, he told himself it was just another chance to keep his daughter fed. He didn't expect marble floors, a corner office on the 40th floor, or a CEO whose face stopped his heart cold. Same jawline, same small scar above the left brow, same way she tilted her head when she was thinking. His dead wife had been buried in an empty coffin 6 years ago, so why was she sitting across from him extending her hand and saying, "I'm Diana Hartwell. Welcome to your interview." Caleb Morrison was the kind of man who fixed things. Leaky faucets, cracked drywall, busted circuit breakers. If something was broken, he found a way to patch it back together. That had always been true, even before the accident. Back when he was a licensed structural engineer with a steady salary, a small house in Denton, Ohio, and a wife who smelled like lavender soap and burned every batch of pancakes she ever attempted. Back when life made a certain kind of sense. That was before the rain, before the phone call at 2 in the morning, before a police officer sat across from him at the kitchen table and used the word presumed in a sentence about Ellie. 6 years ago, Caleb Morrison stopped being an engineer and started being a father. Just a father. That was enough. That had to be enough. Rosie was 8 now, gap-toothed and opinionated with her mother's dark brown eyes and her father's stubbornness about shoes. She hated Velcro, but couldn't tie laces fast enough, which meant every school morning began with a low-stakes negotiation. Neither of them technically won. She kept a photograph of Ellie on the corner of her desk, a snapshot from a barbecue 3 summers before she was born. Ellie laughing at something off-camera, hair pulled back messily, a mustard stain on her shirt she apparently hadn't noticed yet. Rosie had found the photo in a box when she was 5 and declared it her favorite picture in the world. Caleb had never moved it. He wasn't sure he could. The money situation had been tight for a long time, but the last 2 months had tipped from tight into genuinely uncomfortable. The small contracting firm Caleb had been doing freelance work for Brennan and Sons, a 2-truck operation that mostly handled residential renovations, filed for Chapter 7 in early September. Just like that, the work was gone. Caleb had a little over $400 in checking 2 months behind on rent to a landlord who was patient, but not infinitely so, and a letter from Rosie's new school about a field trip deposit due by Friday. He sat at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, going through the numbers for the 3rd time, as if they might rearrange themselves into something more hopeful, and he thought about calling his brother in Columbus. He didn't call. He opened his laptop instead and started searching job listings. The posting for Hartwell Industries had been up for 3 weeks. Senior Construction Oversight Engineer On-Site Project Management for a large-scale commercial development in downtown Cleveland. The salary range was more than Caleb had earned in any single year before he'd stepped back from full-time work. The requirements were stiff: a decade of experience, proficiency with project management software he'd used but was rusty on, and a willingness to report directly to the CEO's office on major decisions. His friend Dale, who'd done some electrical subcontracting for Hartwell the previous year, had nudged him about it twice already. "It's serious money, Cal. Just send the resume." Caleb sent the resume. He didn't expect a callback. He got one 4 days later from a woman named Patricia Owens, who had a brisk, efficient voice, and scheduled him for a Thursday morning slot without asking if Thursday worked for him. He borrowed a tie from Dale. He told Rosie he was going to a meeting. He drove 90 minutes to Cleveland, parked in a structure that charged $11 for the first hour, and walked into a building with a glass facade that reflected the gray October sky back at itself in clean, expensive panels. The lobby had marble floors, actual marble, not the laminate kind, and a reception desk staffed by 2 people in matching blazers. There was a large framed photograph on the wall near the elevator bank, part of what appeared to be a gallery of company leadership. Caleb barely glanced at it on the way in. He was focused on not looking as nervous as he felt, on remembering the names of the software programs he'd listed on his resume, on the slightly too tight knot in Dale's borrowed tie. "Patricia Owens." "Pat," she said. Shaking his hand in the 34th floor conference room, was mid-50s, sharp-eyed, and had the energy of someone who ran on good coffee and tight schedules. She walked him through the project overview, a mixed-use development that Hartwell was breaking ground on in the spring, and asked him a series of precise technical questions that Caleb found himself answering more fluidly than he'd expected. 6 years away from the industry, and the instincts were still there, apparently sitting just under the surface and waiting. Pat made small check marks on a notepad. She told him the CEO liked to sit in briefly on final round interviews just to get a sense of the person. She said it lightly as though it were routine. Caleb said that was fine. He straightened Dale's tie. The door opened, and Diana Hartwell walked in, and Caleb Morrison's entire body went still in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back, moving with the efficient ease of someone who was accustomed to every room adjusting to her entrance. She was looking down at a folder Pat had handed her, and she hadn't looked up yet. And in those 3 seconds, Caleb noticed 3 things simultaneously: the angle of her jaw, the way she carried her left shoulder slightly lower than her right, an old habit he'd always assumed from the way she used to sling her bag, and the small, pale crescent scar above her left eyebrow. Ellie had gotten that scar at age 9 falling off a neighbor's fence. She'd told Caleb the story on their 3rd date, touching the spot absently while she talked. He had kissed it once a long time ago. Diana Hartwell looked up from the folder, extended her hand across the table and said, "Mr. Morrison, I'm Diana Hartwell. Thanks for coming in." Her voice was measured, professional, entirely unfamiliar. Her face was not. Caleb shook her hand. He said something he would not be able to recall exactly what afterward, something appropriate and professional, and the interview continued, and he answered questions, and Diana Hartwell asked 2 or 3 pointed things about timeline management and stakeholder communication, and at no point during any of it did she look at him as though she had ever seen him before in her life, because she hadn't. That was the thing that sat in the center of his chest like a stone for the entire drive home. She hadn't recognized him at all. Not a flicker. Not a hesitation. Nothing. She had looked at him the way you look at a stranger, because as far as Diana Hartwell was concerned, that was exactly what he was. Pat called him the next morning with an offer. The salary she named made him close his eyes for a moment. He told her he needed to think about it. He sat in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes, watching Rosie through the kitchen window as she ate cereal and argued with a homework worksheet. Then he went inside. Rosie looked up and said, "Are we going to be able to do the field trip? Mia said the bus is really nice." Caleb sat down across from her, watched her push cereal around her bowl, and thought about an empty coffin in a cemetery on the east side of Denton, where he still paid for the annual maintenance of the plot. He called Pat back that afternoon and accepted the position. He told himself he was doing it for Rosie. He told himself it was just a job. He was not entirely honest with himself on either count. The first 2 weeks at Hartwell Industries were professionally smooth and personally disorienting in a way that Caleb couldn't fully explain to anyone, including himself. The work was real and absorbing site assessments, contractor negotiations, coordination with the architectural firm, and he was good at it better than he'd expected after the years away. The team was competent and collegial. Pat ran a tight operation and was straightforwardly helpful without being warm in the way that required reciprocal warmth. Diana Hartwell herself moved through the company with the steady authority of someone who had built something and knew its dimensions exactly. She was not unkind, but she was contained. She remembered everyone's name, asked precise questions, and kept a consistent professional distance that seemed less like aloofness and more like deliberate self-management, as though she had made a studied decision about which parts of herself were available at work and enforced it carefully. Caleb watched her the way you watch something you're trying to understand, without being caught looking. He cataloged things he couldn't stop noticing. She drummed 2 fingers against her collarbone, when she was working through a problem, a gesture so specific it felt like a key turning in a lock somewhere in his memory. She hummed while waiting for the elevator, always the same 4 or 5 notes of something without a discernible melody. She took her coffee with an amount of sugar that would have been embarrassing to order aloud in certain company. All of it was Ellie. All of it was also simultaneously a woman he had never met. The combination was its own particular kind of vertigo, and Caleb lived inside it every day and said nothing because what was there to say? Because what do you say? He called a man named Ray Dunbar 3 weeks into the job. Dunbar had been the detective on Ellie's case, a quiet, methodical man who'd been kind to Caleb in the specific way that law enforcement learns to be kind to people receiving the worst news of their lives. He was retired now, living outside Akron, and he picked up on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Caleb explained what he'd found. There was a long pause when he finished. Dunbar said carefully, "Cal, you've been carrying this for 6 years. Sometimes grief does things to how we see." Caleb said he understood that. He also said he knew about the scar, and he described it, and there was another long pause, and Dunbar said he would make some calls. A week later, Dunbar called back with what he'd found through channels he didn't fully explain. A woman matching Ellie's general description had been admitted to Harlan County Regional Hospital in rural Kentucky approximately 6 years ago, severely hypothermic with head trauma consistent with a vehicle impact, no identification. She had remained unconscious for 11 days. When she woke up, she had no memory of who she was, where she was from, or how she had gotten there. She had been in the hospital for 3 weeks before a man named Gerald Hartwell, who happened to be on the hospital's donor board, had visited, and according to the nurses, who still remembered the story, taken an immediate and apparently genuine interest in her welfare. Within a month, she had been transferred to a private care facility in Connecticut. Within a year, she had a new name. The river that ran past the curve where Ellie's car had gone off the road in Ohio flowed south, into Kentucky. Caleb sat with that information for a very long time before he moved again. The company held a team-building retreat on a Saturday in late October at a conference center outside the city. Families were welcome, the invitation said, which Caleb interpreted as a polite gesture not intended to be taken literally, and then took literally anyway, because Mrs. Faber, who usually watched Rosie on weekends, had a dental procedure, and there was no one else. He brought Rosie, who wore her good sneakers, and immediately identified the location of the snack table with the accuracy of a search and rescue dog. The morning was presentations and breakout sessions. After lunch, people drifted outside to a courtyard where someone had set up lawn games nobody was fully committed to. Rosie had found 2 other children and was engaged in a project involving pine cones whose purpose was unclear. Caleb was standing near the courtyard wall with a cup of coffee when Diana Hartwell came out of the building, alone, heels traded for flats, jacket folded over one arm, looking for a moment like someone who was glad to be outside. She saw Rosie before Rosie saw her. Caleb watched Diana's steps slow as she took in the small, dark-haired girl crouched over a collection of pine cones, brow furrowed in concentration, and something changed in Diana's face that Caleb had no professional language for. It wasn't recognition exactly. It was subtler than that, and more unsettling. It was the look of someone experiencing an emotion they don't have the context to explain, a feeling arriving without its memory attached. She had stopped walking entirely. Her hand had come up slightly, not quite reaching toward anything, just lifting as though her body had begun a gesture her mind hadn't authorized. Then Rosie looked up, saw a woman looking at her, and said with the complete social fearlessness of an 8-year-old, "Hi, do you work with my dad?" Diana said yes, she did. Rosie said, "He says you have a cool building." Diana almost smiled. Then Rosie, with the specific cruelty of total innocence, tilted her head and said, "You look like my mom. My dad has a picture of her. She looks like you." The almost smile disappeared. Diana Hartwell went very still, and then she said quietly, "I'm sure she's beautiful." And then she excused herself and walked back inside with the controlled pace of someone who is moving carefully because they don't trust themselves to move fast. Caleb had seen all of it. He set down his coffee cup on the wall, and he did not go after her, and he did not go to pieces, and he stood in the courtyard in the thin October sunlight while Rosie returned to her pine cones, and he understood with a clarity that felt like ice water that he had been right, and that being right was both everything and also almost nothing, because the woman who had just walked inside did not know him. She didn't know Rosie. She had no memory of an Ohio house, or a barbecue photograph, or burned pancakes on Sunday mornings, and the feeling behind her eyes when she'd looked at Rosie was not recognition, but something more like grief at a loss she couldn't name, which was its own terrible thing. Caleb drove home that evening and sat on the edge of Rosie's bed after she fell asleep and looked at the photograph on her desk for a long time. He requested a private meeting with Diana through Pat. The request was granted 15 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon, framed as a project update. He brought a manila envelope. He sat down across from her in her office, with its clean lines, and the city visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, and he said he needed to talk to her about something that wasn't the project. Diana looked at the envelope, and then at him with the careful neutral expression she wore as a kind of armor, and said, "Mr. Morrison, if this is personal, I'd prefer." And Caleb said, "I know you don't remember me. That's not your fault. But I need you to look at these." He opened the envelope and set the photographs on her desk. Their wedding photo, a picture from a camping trip, Rosie's birth announcement with Ellie's name printed on it, in small sans serif letters. Diana looked at the photographs. The armor cracked slightly, not into emotion, but into something more unsettling uncertainty, the expression of someone whose body is responding to something their mind refuses. She looked at his face, and then at the photographs, and then she stood up and said in a voice that was controlled in the specific way that precedes losing control, "I don't know what you're trying to do here, but I need you to leave my office." She called Pat before Caleb reached the elevator. Gerald Hartwell was on a plane from New York the next morning. He was a tall man in his late 60s, white-haired and patrician with the manners of someone who had been wealthy long enough that courtesy felt like a form of power rather than warmth. He met with Caleb in a small conference room while Pat sat to one side, and a man Caleb assumed was a company attorney sat to the other. Gerald said with genuine composure that he understood Caleb's situation and had compassion for it, and that he was also prepared to pursue legal action for harassment and defamation if Caleb continued to approach Diana with these claims. He said that Diana had worked very hard to build a stable life and identity, that her psychological health was not robust when it came to questions about her past, and that forcing this confrontation could cause serious harm. The attorney confirmed this was a matter they were prepared to litigate. Caleb sat across the table from a man who had found his wife in a hospital room and chosen not to look further, and he kept his voice level, and he said he understood, and he stood up and left the room without signing anything, because no one had asked him to sign anything yet, and walking away without signing something felt at that moment like the only form of agency he had left. That evening, Rosie developed a fever. By midnight, it was 103. By the following morning, she was in the emergency room at Cleveland Metro with a diagnosis of acute appendicitis, and by early afternoon, she was in pre-op. Caleb sat in a waiting room chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his chin resting on his knuckles. And he thought about absolutely nothing, because thinking about something required a foundation of stability that he currently did not possess. He had called Dale, who was driving up from Denton. He had called the school. He had called Pat to explain he wouldn't be in, and had then sat looking at his phone for a moment before putting it in his pocket, because there was no one else to call. The surgery would take about 45 minutes, the attending had told him. It was routine, she'd said, meaning it went fine almost every time. Caleb understood about almost. Diana Hartwell arrived at Cleveland Metro at 9:30 that evening for an entirely separate reason. The migraines had been coming more frequently for 3 weeks since the team retreat, if she was tracking it honestly, which her neurologist required her to do. They weren't ordinary migraines, hadn't been since her original injury. They arrived with fragments, attached, disconnected sensory material that her brain produced without context. A sound, a smell, a color, sometimes a face or a partial face, gone before it resolved into anything recognizable. Her neurologist had referred her to a specialist at Metro, and she was there for a late appointment she'd scheduled because she didn't want anyone at the office to know how frequent the episodes had become. She was crossing the main lobby toward the neurology wing when she saw Caleb Morrison sitting in a row of waiting room chairs, alone, in the particular posture of a person in controlled distress. Everything held in everything visible anyway, if you knew how to look. She stopped walking. She hadn't seen him since the meeting in her office. She had thought about him several times since then, in ways she hadn't examined closely. She stood in the lobby and watched him for a moment, and then she walked over and sat down 2 chairs away from him, and she said, in the most ordinary voice she could manage, "Is it your daughter?" Caleb looked up at her. He said yes. She said, "Is she going to be okay?" He said the surgery was routine. Neither of them moved to leave. They sat in those chairs for 2 hours. They didn't speak for much of it, and when they did, it was quietly, in the halting way that people talk when they're both very tired, and the normal social scaffolding has been temporarily removed. Diana said her doctors had been managing some neurological symptoms for years related to an accident. Caleb said he was sorry to hear that. She looked at her hands in her lap and said carefully, "The photographs you brought me. I'm not saying you fabricated them. I want to be clear about that." Caleb said he knew. She said, "I don't have anything before 6 years ago. Not memories, not a sense of before. There's just nothing there." Her voice was even practiced, the voice of someone who had described this fact many times and had learned to describe it without drowning in it. Caleb sat with that for a moment. Then he did something he had not planned to do, something that came from somewhere below the level of strategy or plan he hummed. 4 bars of a song, an old Patsy Cline song, something his mother had played in the car when he was small, something he used to hum to Ellie in the kitchen late at night when they were washing dishes. He hummed it once quietly and then stopped. Diana Hartwell went completely motionless. It was not a performance. It was the stillness of someone whose nervous system has received a signal it doesn't understand, but recognizes at a level below, understanding the way you might stop cold on a street corner because something smelled like your grandmother's house without warning. She was very still for a long time. Then she put her face in her hands, and she didn't make any sound, but her shoulders moved, and Caleb looked away at the far wall of the waiting room and let her have whatever this was without an audience. The surgeon came out at 11:15 and said the procedure had gone perfectly, and Rosie was in recovery and could see her dad in 20 minutes. Caleb said, "Thank you." When he turned back, Diana was sitting upright again, composed, eyes dry. She looked at him and said, "I'm going to talk to my doctor." He nodded. She stood up and smoothed her coat and started to say something else, and then didn't, and walked away toward the elevator. Caleb sat back down to wait for his daughter. The process that followed was not fast. Diana's neurologist referred her to a specialist in trauma-related memory recovery, a woman in her 50s who worked out of a clinic in Columbus and who made clear at the first appointment that this kind of work could not be rushed and that the brain under these circumstances had its own timeline that no one was fully in charge of. Diana went twice a week. Gerald Hartwell knew she told him, herself, told him she was doing it, and watched his face for the thing she had half suspected and half feared to find there. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then he sat down heavily in the chair in his study and said, "I knew you might have had a family. I knew it was possible, and I chose not to pursue it, and I have to live with that." His voice was even, but his hands were not. He said it was the most selfish thing he had ever done, and that he wasn't going to insult her by asking for her forgiveness before she was ready. Diana sat across from him in the room where she had grown up in this second life she had built, without knowing it was a second life, and she felt something complicated and unresolved that she did not try to simplify. The memories came back in pieces the way the specialist had warned they would, non-linear sense-led, often arriving not in sessions, but at random moments during ordinary days. The smell of a particular dish soap at the grocery store stopped her cold one afternoon in a way that she couldn't explain for a week until a session surfaced, a memory of a kitchen small and bright and a man at the sink. A song on the radio in a coffee shop was followed 2 days later by a dream she woke from trembling, a dream of rain and road and black water and cold. She lost a meeting once because she had glanced out the window at the particular gray-white color of an overcast November sky and disappeared into something she couldn't pull herself back from for several minutes. Pat covered for her without being asked, and without asking why. Diana had underestimated how much Pat had always known and chosen not to say. By December, she had enough. Not everything her specialist was clear that everything was probably not a realistic target, and that some things would remain inaccessible. But enough the shape of a life, the weight of a name, a small house in Denton, a man who burned toast and was too proud to buy pre-sliced bread, a pregnancy test held in hands that shook, the name Rosie chosen on a Tuesday night over takeout from a Thai place that had since closed because they had both just liked it. Caleb, who had not once in the 6 years she'd been gone, moved her photograph from the living room wall. Caleb, who had brought his daughter to a company retreat because he had no one else, and who had sat in a hospital waiting room alone, and who had walked into her office with an envelope full of evidence, knowing full well she might call security. She sat in her Columbus hotel room after a session in early December and understood that she had been loved with the particular stubborn totality of someone who had absolutely no backup plan for a world in which she didn't exist. She called Pat, who was not surprised by any of it, which was its own kind of gift. Rosie was released from the hospital on the 3rd day after surgery, moving slowly and with great personal drama about the car ride home, convinced every bump in the road was targeted at her specifically. She was eating soft foods and reading a book about a girl who found a dragon egg, and she was going to be completely fine. Caleb had come back to work on day 4, thinner in the face and quieter than usual, and nobody said anything about Diana. And Diana was working remotely out of Columbus anyway, so the office simply absorbed his absence and his return, and continued as offices do. He had not heard from her since the hospital. He didn't know what she was doing, or what she remembered, or what she'd decided, and he had arrived at a strange equilibrium about the not knowing, not peace exactly, but something like the ability to hold the uncertainty without being destroyed by it, which was a thing he had learned to do over 6 years, and was, he supposed, its own kind of skill. She came to the house on a Saturday afternoon in late December, 2 days before Christmas, when the light was coming in, low and silver through the front windows, and Rosie was at Dale's for the afternoon, so Caleb could wrap presents without an audience. He heard a car in the driveway and looked out and stood there for a moment before he went to the door. Diana Hartwell. Ellie Morrison was standing on his front step in a coat he didn't recognize, with a face he had known for most of his adult life, looking at him with eyes that were different from the ones in his memory, not in their color or their shape, but in their expression because they weren't the eyes of someone who didn't know him. She said, "I remember the porch light being crooked." He looked at the porch light, which was in fact slightly crooked. Had been slightly crooked for at least 4 years. He hadn't fixed it because fixing it had never felt urgent. He stepped back from the door without saying anything, and she came inside. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and talked in the way that people talk when they have both too much and not enough time, when the thing they are trying to bridge is too large for any individual sentence to span, and all you can do is lay one plank at a time and trust the structure. She told him what she remembered and what she didn't. She told him what Gerald had admitted and what she had decided about that, which was complicated and unfinished, and probably would remain so, but which was also her decision to make. She told him about the migraines, about the fragments that had been arriving for years without context, about the sound of a song in a waiting room at 11 at night, and what it had done to her. Caleb listened. He told her about Rosie's first word, which had been hot, because she'd reached for a coffee cup, and he'd said the word sharply, and she'd repeated it with great satisfaction. He told her about the camping trip photo, how Rosie had found it and adopted it. He told her, looking at the table rather than at her face, that he had never had a service for the grave, because it had never felt right, and that he'd gone occasionally and stood in front of the stone and had nothing to say, and left, and that he'd always assumed that was grief behaving strangely, but maybe it had been something else. Diana put her hand flat on the table between them, not reaching toward him, not asking for anything, just there. Caleb looked at her hand, and then at her face, and he put his hand next to hers, not touching, just near. That was where they were, when Rosie came home early from Dale's, blowing through the front door, still in her coat, and stopped short at the kitchen doorway. Rosie looked at the woman sitting at her kitchen table. She was 8, not 6, and she had been looking at that photograph for 3 years, and she was her father's daughter, which meant she was stubborn and observant, and did not waste time on things that weren't true. She said without particular drama, as though naming something she had always known was there. "You came back." Diana slid off her chair and went to her knees on the kitchen floor and opened her arms, and Rosie crossed the kitchen and walked into them, and Diana held her daughter for the first time in 6 years, with her eyes shut and her face in Rosie's hair. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the low December light and let the moment be what it was. Christmas that year was a quiet thing, not a resolution. No one pretended it was that, because none of them were people who could sustain a pretense for long, especially Rosie, who had recently declared pretending to be mostly a waste of time. It was a beginning, which is different from a resolution, and in most ways more honest. Diana spent Christmas Eve in a hotel 20 minutes away and came over in the morning, bringing a pie she had apparently not made herself and was not pretending to have made herself, which Caleb appreciated on principle. Gerald Hartwell had already begun working with an attorney, not his usual firm, on the legal process of restoring Ellie Morrison's documented identity, a matter that would take months and was full of paperwork that no one had written a template for, because this kind of thing was rarer than people assumed. Ray Dunbar, reached by phone on Christmas afternoon, said he was glad, in the careful way of a retired detective who had always suspected the case wasn't what it appeared to be and had never fully made peace with the file being closed. Caleb thanked him. Dunbar said to give Rosie his best. He didn't know Rosie, but the sentiment was real. Weeks later, on a Tuesday evening that was entirely ordinary in every external respect, Caleb was on a step stool in the kitchen, replacing a light bulb in the overhead fixture that had finally given out. Rosie was at the table doing homework with the focused aggression she brought to math. The front door opened, and Ellie. Not Diana Hartwell, not the CEO from the 40th floor, but the woman who had burned pancakes and laughed at things off camera, and once driven 2 hours to bring Caleb soup when he had a bad cold, because he'd mentioned it in passing, came in from the cold with 2 bags of groceries and her coat still buttoned, kicking the door shut behind her with her heel. "The parking on this block is a disaster," she said to no one in particular, setting the bags on the counter. Rosie said without looking up from her worksheet, "It's always been like that." Caleb came down off the step stool and tested the light. It came on. He turned to look at her, standing in his kitchen. In a coat she was starting to unbutton, and she looked back at him, the way she had looked at him 20 feet from an open grave 6 months ago. Clearly, and without pretense, and with the specific gravity of someone who understands exactly what they are choosing and why. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. Some things didn't need words to be true, which was something they had both learned separately and at great cost over the same 6 years. Rosie said, "Can someone help me with number 7? And they both turned toward her at the same time, and the kitchen was warm, and the light was on, and that was for now exactly enough.